again, welcome everybody. Thank you, Flo, for doing this for us. And just before you jump into your presentation, would you mind just sharing a brief intro on you and your background?
Yeah, of course. I'm going to be talking about this mainly in the presentation, so I'll keep it brief. But I'm Flo. Thank you everyone for turning up. I'm doing a research master's at the moment at the University of Glasgow into gull migration. My background is in zoology and wildlife rehabilitation, including the rearing of many gull chicks over the years. I spend my free time thinking about gulls, talking about gulls, and trying to make other people like gulls. So that's what I'm doing here tonight. Please forgive my weird sounding voice if you can notice over Zoom. I'm just getting over a cold, so I've got a bit of a husky throat at the moment, but hopefully that won't stop me rambling on about gulls tonight until you're probably tired of hearing about them. Are you ready just for me to start the presentation? Yeah? Cool. Okay, sorry. Right. Okay, let's make sure this works. Okay, can you see the slides? I can't see what I'm sharing.
Yes, we have your slides.
Okay, great. I couldn't tell if it was showing like when it shows the slides on the top corner, if the whole screen slide.
We've
the
set
whole
it
screen.
so that, we've set it so that we can see your slides and then you at the side.
Right. Okay, so just the slide. Great, got it. Okay. So yeah, I wanted to talk about gulls this evening in as positive a way as possible, because usually when people talk about gulls, the narrative tends to be quite negative, which is very sad. And I really want an opportunity to have a positive evening about gulls. So there will be the odd part where I have to mention something negative, but I'm keeping it as positive as possible. So that's my aim this evening. So first of all, what is a gull? Well, gulls are seabirds of the family Laridae with the terns and skimmers, but they're not pelagic, which basically means they're not necessarily associated with the sea. Many gulls are actually coastal or inland birds, and some never actually go out to sea at all. In the UK, the only truly pelagic gull we do have is the kittiwake, whereas the others are mainly coastal. Gulls have webbed feet and often grey backs with white bodies and wings, but this isn't the general rule. Usually the gulls in the UK you'll see will fit this mold, but other gulls around the world won't necessarily look like this. They range in size from about 120 grams, which is the case for the little gull, as in the species little gull, up to nearly 2 kilos, which is the case with the great black-backed gull, the largest gull in the world. Gulls breed on every continent. They lay 2 to 3 eggs, and they have semi-precocial young. Semi-precocial are sort of in between the bold nestlings you get, which are altricial, and ducklings, for example, which are precocial, and they're very independent from day one. Gulls are kind of in the middle of this because they're downy when they hatch, but they're not very independent from day one. They stick around the nest for a while. Male and female gulls are similar to each other, but males are generally larger and bulkier. And they're generalist as species. People see gulls as being animals that can live anywhere, eat anything, but they're actually specialists as individuals. So an individual gull is unlikely to exploit every resource going. And there are about 51 species of gulls, but it's not accepted by everyone, whether it's 51, 52 or fewer, because there is some discrepancy around what constitutes a species or a subspecies. But it's generally accepted that you can usually see around 11 in the UK plus vagrants, but you usually see about 6 different types day to day. So just for interest, I've put longevity records for the gulls that you're most likely to see in the UK. This gull you can see in the picture here was called Ruari because he was found in Inverurie at one of the wildlife rescue centres I used to work at. If you look closely in the picture, you can see that he's wearing a metal ring on his right leg. And when he came into captivity, because he'd been hit by a car, if I remember correctly, we found out that he'd actually been ringed in 1997 and he was taken into captivity in 2018. So not only was he 21 years old, but at the time he was only 9 months younger than I was. He'd been injured when we took him in, and he'd only been caught a few kilometers away from where he'd first been ringed. So at the time I thought, oh, he's been in the same town his whole life, he's hardly moved. But if you know what I now know about common gulls, they actually travel all around Europe. So we really don't know where he spent his life. He could have been to several other countries. All we know is that he was born in Inverurie and he was caught again in Inverurie in 2018. So you might have noticed that I've been saying gulls a lot and I haven't been saying seagulls, and there's a reason for this. I advocate for you to do the same. The problem with calling gulls seagulls is, first of all, it associates them with the sea, whereas many gulls don't actually spend much time at sea or any time at all. A lot of gulls are coastal and inland, and some really never do go out to sea in their whole lives. Also, media and people who don't like gulls tend to say things like, oh, they should be out at sea or send them back to sea, which really is suggesting that they've invaded us from the sea, which just isn't true. Media also likes to generally blame seagulls for aggressive acts done against people, or aggressive, is what the media portrays them as, which tends to tar them all with the same brush, and it makes it sound like every species out there in the whole world exhibits the same behaviors in the same scenarios, which they simply don't. It almost makes them all sound like they're the same species and one type of bird when they're actually very diverse in behavior, and they vary in their association with people in urban areas. Some species in the world, no doubt, have never stolen food from us, but the way we speak about gulls makes it sound like every species is one and the same, and that every gull is a problem. I think as well that children are very unlikely to build up an interest in gulls if they're being taught that every gull they see is just a seagull and nothing more. If they point up the sky and say, "What's that?" and you just say it's a seagull, and every single one they see is a seagull, then they're really never going to build an interest further than that. And I think that's probably what happened with me growing up, because not only did I think every gull was a seagull, but I'd also never heard of a tern until I left for university. And terns often get called seagulls as well because they're semi-similar in appearance, and so people often just call them seagulls. So I think it's a good start to stop calling them seagulls and at least call them gulls. One of the authors that I've read about this issue has also said that using the word seagull prevents us from having any further interest in what gulls actually are, and almost makes them invisible to us. It's almost like a full stop. It's a seagull, that's end of discussion, case closed. On the other hand, the reason I would suggest saying gulls, you might think, well, why just take away the SEA? Why does that matter? You're still calling them gulls. Well, first of all, it takes away the association with the sea, which is very important for the reasons I've explained. It acknowledges that either you're referring to gulls generally, all the species in the world, or you're leaving a space before the word gull to fill it with the species once you find it out, whether it be because it's a knowledge gap or because you're talking about gulls in general, and so you're not naming the species. But it still acknowledges the diversity of gulls because you're just calling them gulls and leaving space for dolphin gull, swallow-tailed gull, Ross's gull, etc. And sometimes when you say gull around people who say seagulls, they then ask you, why do you call them gulls? Don't you mean seagulls? And then you get to explain everything I've just said, or you just get to talk about gulls, which for me is a great excuse to be talking about something you want to talk about. But talking about gull diversity, for any vegans watching, including myself, by the way, we actually have our own gull, the Vega gull, which breeds in Siberia. So why are gulls even here? Well, it's unsurprising that gulls are around us because we're pretty much everywhere. So we're going to be living in close proximity to all sorts of wildlife, which is exactly the case. We urbanize natural areas where gulls have no doubt been living before we even moved in, and gulls did evolve around about the same time as us, so we can't exactly say we've been here longer than they have. But we cause problems even where we aren't. We carry out large-scale culling of natural colonies, certainly we have in the past. We destroy their habitat, we pollute places where they forage for food, and all these things causes gulls to redistribute and to disperse to places where they can find food, and urban areas have been perfect for that. A large turning point in this was actually the Clean Air Act of 1956, which made it illegal to burn at landfill sites. And this then gave gulls an ample food source, which they didn't have before, which tended to be near or in urban areas. Again, gulls, they're not pelagic, so they're already inland. It's not that they've just arrived from the sea, but they were already here. But they're now utilizing urban areas more than ever before. Urban areas are attractive to them because the flat roofs we provide are a lot like sea cliffs and they're easy food sources. Many do go out to forage in rural areas and coastal areas, though, even though they live in urban sites, they can travel for tens of miles to go and forage. So they're not necessarily all foraging in urban areas. I think it's quite summed up pretty well by gull expert Peter Rock, who simply said they're here to invitation, and I think that's exactly the case. You probably weren't expecting to see lions in a discussion about gulls. Unfortunately, many people do dislike gulls, and I often use lions as an example. I say people tend to love lions and love leopards, but for people in other countries, they're far more of a disruption and far greater risk to people's lives than gulls ever are. But because we don't have to worry about them, it's easy for us to love them. We love leopards, we love lions, elephants, all these big animals, which to us are amazing, but to other people are a real risk to their life sometimes. So we basically value everything on how it impacts us personally. And if we like dangerous animals, and I think we have no reason to dislike gulls. And a reason I've got a dog picture here, this is actually my old family dog, is that dogs and cats injure thousands of people every year. But because our positive interactions of dogs and cats far outweigh our negative interactions, most of us love them. And so we see them as positive, our interactions with them are positive. But it's very hard to have this with gulls, because if you're only getting your sandwich taken by a gull, or a gull swooping you because you're too close to their nest, you're only having negative interactions with gulls, and it's very hard to have a positive interaction with a gull. And therefore we see them as bad all of the time. But saying that gulls are aggressive or even evil, which some people do brand them as being, is because they can injure people, I would say is just as much of a pure generalization as saying that dogs and cats are evil or aggressive because you can get bitten by a dog or you can get scratched by a cat. Research does suggest, though, that only a very small proportion of gulls actually do take food from people's hands. But again, because it's the only interaction we tend to have with gulls, it's easy just to assume that every gull's at it when they're not. It's sad that so many people loathe them, when in the grand scheme of things, they treat us pretty mildly. Again, compare them to the lions and the leopards, they're really not that much of an issue compared to how people act. I'm not saying that people can never be annoyed by gulls, but they don't pose nearly the same risk to us as many of the wild and domestic animals that we love do. It's important to understand as well that when we do get swooped by a gull because they're protecting their young, or when we get our food stolen out of our hand by a gull, for them, this is a survival strategy. They're not just doing it for fun. Most of us won't starve if we're walking down the street and we have our sandwich taken from us, but that gull might starve if it doesn't take food from us that day. When they take food that people have dropped on the ground, they're actually the city's cleanup crews. Not only do they take food that might be eaten by rats and pigeons, but they can also directly eat rats and pigeons themselves. And I've heard a lot of media articles complaining about gulls swallowing a rat whole or eating a pigeon, but most of the people who complain about that also dislike rats and pigeons. So that's a little bit ironic, I find. But when gulls swoop us to protect their young if we're near their nests, I see this as quite similar to when a swallow swoops a sparrowhawk. This is something they're doing despite the fact that it's a great risk to them. Gulls fear us, and it's understandable because people do kill gulls. People do take chicks and eggs from nests. So they're no way wrong to be scared of us. Thermal evidence does actually show that if you approach a gull, they initiate a stress response and they're more likely to fly away or not take food if they know that you're staring at them. There's something that biologists discuss, which is called the beautifying of nature. And it's when people value species based on what we like or what we dislike from a species. So, for example, animals like reptiles, amphibians, some insects like beetles and wasps. If you think about moths versus butterflies, for example, butterflies tend to be a lot more popular than moths. Value judgments like this can lead to certain species being forgotten, and it's very hard to conserve them when compared to more popular species, which may lead to certain extinctions in the future. And because we view some species as more important than others, this is a real risk. And I think it's something we really need to think about when it comes to us almost deciding what deserves to live and what doesn't deserve to live. So in conclusion, the issue is our inability to coexist with species which inconvenience us and wildlife which apparently doesn't deserve to live if we don't enjoy its company. So despite not being similar enough to us to warrant our love a lot of the time, gulls actually do have some similarities to humans. They're very protective of their young, something which is usually seen as honourable in other species. I think when it comes to mammals, we tend to think this is good, but when it comes to birds and maybe other animals, we think it's annoying or a nuisance. Gulls tend to mate for life, although they may divorce if they repeatedly fail to breed or they're in a failing colony. Again, not dissimilar to humans. Gulls can show same-sex coupling. In some colonies of gulls, up to 10% of couples are actually same-sex, with two females rearing one clutch. When two gulls are away from each other, one's maybe been sitting on the nest and the other's been away foraging for a few hours. When they come back, they often vocalize to each other, almost like they're saying hello. They're also very good at facial recognition. Understandably, they can recognize one another, but they can also recognize us. And if I was to ask if you could do the inverse, most people, including myself, wouldn't be able to recognize lots of different gulls just by face, but they can recognize people by face, which I think is quite impressive. There's a gull ringer I know called Paul, and he can walk into many different parks around Glasgow, and every gull from that park will fly away because they recognize him. It doesn't matter what he's wearing, they'll know it's him, and they'll disappear straight away because they know that he'll try and put a ring on them, he'll try and catch them. And they don't know what he wants to catch them for, so naturally they leave, they don't want anything to do with him. And my partner also is used to going on rooftop nests of gulls, and the similar thing has happened to him. He was once walking past one of the roof nest sites, and one gull, maybe about 100 feet in the air, saw him from above. He was wearing different clothes because he wasn't working that day. He just happened to be walking past. The gull saw him from above, started circling, made a vocalization, started circling, and then about 20 other gulls appeared, and they circled above him and they followed him for about a mile until he was a mile away from their nest site. So they're very good at recognizing people. Tool use has also been seen in gulls. There was a herring gull, I believe, in France, which was seen using bread to lure fish and then trying to catch the fish. So it was using the bread as a bait. And I think this isn't only intelligent because it's tool use, which is generally linked with intelligence, but because the bread was a food source in itself. So this gull was able to see bread, and instead of eating that bread, which is food, they were able to use that bread to get a richer food source, a food source that would benefit them even more. And I think that's quite clever because in behavioral biology, it's often seen that animals have certain responses to certain cues. So the response to the food cue would just be to eat it. But the gull didn't do that. It used the food, it thought into the future, and it almost thought, what can I do to benefit myself with this food? So I think that is very clever of them. And lastly, they also have impeccable timekeeping. Gulls have been seen timing their behavior with things like playtime, so they fly to schools during playtimes and wait for snacks to be dropped. School holidays, so they know to avoid schools during, for example, the school holidays. Pub closing time, you'll see gulls lining the roofs around closing times, waiting for people to go out getting their chips and kebabs and picking up the food that they drop. They have timed their behavior with tides, so they know when to get natural foods based on the tide times. And even fisheries. In one study I read, the male gulls, not the females for some reason, but the males knew to go to the fisheries for fisheries discards from Monday to Friday, but to avoid them Saturday and Sunday because they knew that the workers wouldn't be there and there would be no food for them. So really, they deserve a lot more credit than we give them. Their resourcefulness is a sign of great intelligence, and their ability to exploit urban areas is a sign of great intelligence, but unfortunately, we don't like it. If you're looking at this slide here as well, you can see the chick on the back. You might have all noticed the chick on the bottom right as well, but I didn't notice for a long time, so I just thought I'd point that out to you. So my work with gulls started several years ago when I lived in Aberdeen, and now I live in Glasgow, when my partner and I used to take in injured animals to our flat and either take them straight to the wildlife rescue centre near us or keep them for a few days, depending on what was best for them. We worked with the wildlife rescue centre throughout. We took in a lot of animals, largely pigeons, largely gulls. So that's why there's a pigeon there, just to show that it wasn't all gulls, but there were a lot of gulls, as you can probably see from the pictures. It was the first time I'd really worked closely with gulls, and I was actually quite scared of them. I'd grown up believing that they were vicious and that they attacked you, and that I didn't believe they were evil, but certainly I'd never heard much positive about them, so I was quite scared of them. But I learned from this that they can be gentle, that they're scared of you, which, believe it or not, was surprising to me. The gull in the bottom of the screen there in the cage with the stripes, we called her Tracy. She had a broken wing, and she was very much a turning point for me in terms of how I thought about gulls. I remember one day she was in my bedroom and the cage was open because she wasn't always in a cage. She was on the bedroom floor and I was standing eating a pizza, just looking at her. And I remember being scared to eat this pizza because I thought, okay, gulls are vicious. They jump at you, they steal your food. And I fully expected her to do that, even though she was in a vulnerable position. She had a broken wing and she was in my flat. There was no way she would ever have done something like that. But it was so ingrained into me that gulls were naturally, instinctively vicious, aggressive, almost aggressive by design, that I genuinely thought she would. And I laugh when I think back to it now because there's just no way she ever would have done something like that in such a vulnerable position. And chances are she never would have, because there's so few gulls which actually do things like that in the first place. But Tracy used to walk to our bathroom every day. We'd open the shower for her. She'd go in, have a shower. And then when she was done, she'd tap the glass with her beak, we'd open the door, and then she'd walk back through to the bedroom and put herself back in the cage with a little bit of coaxing, but not much coaxing, until eventually she went to the Wildlife Rescue Centre. So she was a real turning point. I think she taught me a lot about gulls. I was just beginning to kind of think, well, maybe they're not as scary as I thought. The flat we lived in at the time was tiny, so we took our mattress from the bedroom into the living room, and we lived in the living room, and we had cages on our bed frame with gulls or pigeons or whatever, and sometimes stacked a few in the corner of the living room because our flat was very small. So we were living in very close proximity to birds at that time. The gull in the bottom right in the picture in the shower, that's a gull that had been stuck in a chimney. So he was very sooty. I think that picture is possibly his third or fourth shower. The soot makes him look like he has a very angry eyebrow, and he probably felt angry being showered multiple times. And then the gull in the top right, I have no idea how we got caught in that fence. It was a mesh fence with a wooden fence and obviously that weird brambling with a matter of maybe 5 inches between the two. I will never to this day know how on earth he got stuck like that. But the day that we got him out of that was the same day that I was offered a job at the Wildlife Rescue Centre. But off the back of that, briefly, I then did my honours project on gulls, which you can see the title of there. It's kind of like what I was talking about before, the fact that even though dogs are more of a risk to people than gulls are, people in my study viewed gulls as more dangerous than dogs. Kind of, it's, a long story short, but yeah, that was quite interesting. So then I worked at Wildlife Rescue Centre, and we looked after a lot of different animals, hundreds and hundreds a year, but the majority, or at least a large proportion, were gulls, and this was herring gulls at the time. In Aberdeenshire, you do generally get largely herring gulls, whereas when I worked in a wildlife rescue centre in North Ayrshire, it was mainly lesser blackback gulls, which are a little bit smaller. I learned that gulls don't all look the same. I learned that I could actually tell which gull was which from their face up to a certain number, not when it comes to having about 200-300 gulls in any one time. But just to talk about some of the gulls I got to know, Dragon, you can't see on this slide, but there was a gull called Dragon. He was a huge gull to the point that I actually thought that he was a great blackback gull at the time. He wasn't, he was a herring gull, but I didn't know much about gulls and he was huge. So I thought, wow, we can't possibly be a herring gull. But he was huge and he was bold and he was brave, but he never swooped. He wasn't scared of us because we had reared him, but he was never aggressive, never stole food from us. He would follow us around wanting food, and he had an apprentice that he used to take everywhere with him, which was a smaller gull that learned everything from him and was taught by him to wreak havoc. Dragon was kind of your stereotypical bad gull, not in the sense that he was aggressive, but he just wreaked havoc everywhere. He'd drag towels around the site. He would fly off with bowls. He once flew off with a Pringles tube that I put in the bin. Never found it. No idea where it went. I once saw him teaching a magpie how to pull roof insulation out of an aviary roof. So he was standing next to this magpie and he started pulling out this insulation. And then he stepped aside and the magpie was about less than a foot away from him, started doing the same thing, and Dragon just watched him. And they never ate the insulation. They just pulled out and then flew off. I have no idea why he was teaching a magpie, but he just wreaked havoc, really. And then we've got Weggy. She is on the left-hand picture and the top right, the gull that's flying. That's the same gull, Weggy. As you can see, she had a broken leg, which fused in a very strange way. But I got to know her very well, and she was extremely gentle and inquisitive, and she would follow us around for food, but again, never in the slightest bit aggressive. She was extremely gentle. Dino and Lacey, two other gulls. Can't see Lacey here, but Dino is that fluffy chick. Second picture from the right. We called him Dino because simply he was also quite big. Nowhere near as big as Dragon, but he was one of the earliest gulls we had in that year, and he grew a lot quicker than all the other gulls. We called Lacey Lacey because when Dino went out into the big aviary with a lot of other gulls, he met Lacey, and then every time I went to the aviary after that, they would both come over together, and Lacey would always peck at your laces, hence the name. But it taught me that gulls have best friends because Dino and Lacey were always together, never apart. It was never a Dino with another gull, Lacey with another gull. It was always those two together all the time. And then Popeye, he's the one standing on my partner Kevin's shoulder in that picture. He was called Popeye because he had a problem with his eye. He was an absolute sweetheart. He was extremely trusting. He had to be handled and medicated from a very young age because of his eye, including quite invasive eye procedures, which I'm not going to talk about because but he was so gentle and he trusted us, and he lived on site, but he'd fly around and he'd go back into an aviary at night willingly. It was I think it really shows trust is such a big thing with gulls. And of course, most gulls don't trust us, and that's why we don't see necessarily the good sides to them, but they really do have such a good side to them. The gull in the bottom right there, who, believe it or not, is not the size of a barn. He is a black-headed gull. We called him DJ for reasons I'll explain shortly. He was the only black-headed gull we reared in 2018, and he used to sit, when he was released, he used to sit on a disused rabbit hutch where he'd get fed every day. And one day he left, as is the way. That was about July. And then about 3 months later, he came back, not just on his own, but with a friend. And we knew it was him because he and his friend were sitting on the old rabbit hutch, exactly where we used to feed them. And given that he was reared on his own, it was nice that he'd come back with another black-headed gull. So we obviously knew that he was a black-headed gull. And then they went away again. And for all we know, they went abroad to spend their winter. Black-headed gulls, again, move around a lot. I think they came back one more time and then left for good. So these are a handful of the amazing gulls I got to meet. And take-home message is that they were never aggressive. I really just want to tell you and make it clear that gulls can be gentle. They're not naturally aggressive, not aggressive for the sake of it, surely. They can protect their friends. They feel pain. And in a way, the gulls that I met were really no different to cats and dogs, which I think says a lot because cats and dogs have been domesticated for years and years and gulls haven't. So if I can even compare them, then I think it really says something for gulls. So now I'm doing research into lesser black-backed gull migration strategies. I do birding in my free time, including sometimes with gulls, to learn more about their movements. I go out gull ring reading, which is something I'll talk about shortly. I do very small scale gull and pigeon rehabilitating, including the gull you can see in the middle here. He'd been hit by a car July 2022 at about 1 a.m. Just by chance, I happened to be up. And we took him inside, and we only had him for a couple of days because he just needed a bit of TLC because he couldn't walk until a couple of days later. But his parents were looking for him the whole time until we held him up to our window and showed them that he was there. But they accepted him. We put him back about 2.5 days later, and they accepted him because gulls are good parents. And just because he was away for 2 days, we put him back where he was before, and they knew it was him, and they kept looking after him as they should. And the other main thing I did, and something that is probably the most important thing I've ever done, is being part of the 2021 non-lethal gull trial, which is what I'm going to talk about just now briefly. So in 2021, NatureScot, which is the body which issues lethal gull licenses, let my partner's business, Human-gull Solutions, run a non-lethal gull trial. And this began when in 2020, my partner, whose business is completely non-lethal, was asked to take some chicks or eggs off someone's roof. And he didn't want to do this because he wants to leave gulls to rear their young themselves, but he knew that if he didn't, they would then get an illegal pest controller. So then he contacted NatureScot and he said, okay, I'm not going to kill these gulls. I'm going to take them to a wildlife rescue centre. And they responded and they said, okay, that's fine. And he thought, well, if it's fine, then why is it not an option? Why is there not a legal option to do this? So then he asked if he could do the gull trial, and thankfully they said yes. So what happened was we ran a trial whereby pest controllers could take gull chicks and gull eggs to wildlife rescue centres to be reared. Previously, only lethal control was allowed under license. So I wrote the protocols for the pest controllers and the wildlife rehabilitators, which NatureScot sent out to everybody participating. And we were really surprised by how many pest control companies and independent pest controllers wanted to be a part of it, because they've been doing this for years. And so I just assumed that they were happy to kill gulls. But it turns out none of them were, none of the ones that were involved anyway. And not only did they take part, but they were very positive about the whole idea of it. Some of them hated killing gulls. They just thought there wasn't another option. So overall, 474 eggs and chicks, mainly eggs, which otherwise would have been killed or destroyed, were taken into wildlife rescue centres around Scotland. And NatureScot, I was pleasantly surprised, were actually very helpful throughout the whole process. We had a post-hatching success rate, or a post-hatching release rate, of 88%, which is much higher than the natural rate of 50% in the wild. And afterwards, I helped write the post-trial summing up report. And then in December 2021, I had a phone call that said that from the season 2022 onwards, this would now be a license option going forward. So people would be able to do this under license, which completely changed the way that things may be done in Scotland. And I hope that things get better in the future, although there's still a long way to go. But one of the things that NatureScot weren't sure about was whether gulls reared in captivity would even survive. It was almost a challenge they gave us. They said, is this even viable? So we told them we'd ring some of our gulls, and some of our gulls did get rings, and we would let them know if they had survived, which we were sure they would. And in March this year, we had some information about returns on a couple of gulls. So one gull, these gulls were released in July or August, I want to say July of 2021. One gull was then seen in Portugal in November 2021, and then again in Portugal in September and October of 2022, which is over 1,000 miles away from where they were released. And a second gull was seen in Morocco of February of this year, nearly 1,700 miles away from where they've been released. So I think we can say that certainly those two at least have done perfectly well. And this is a piece of art that my partner Kevin had commissioned by our amazing artist friend Kate to commemorate the gull trial. I just wanted to put it in there because I think it's a great commemoration of the trial. A lovely piece of art, which she's actually going to get as a tattoo next year. So talk about migration, as I have done with those gulls in Portugal and Morocco. Most gulls are actually migratory. When I was younger and I would think of bird migration, I thought swallows, swifts, house martins, and that was basically where I'd draw the line. But actually about 50% of the gulls in the UK are migratory, and in some countries, 50% of birds in the UK are migratory, and in some countries, this is about 80% of birds which are migratory. When it comes to gulls, one great example of a migrant is UK-tagged black-headed gulls, which have been found to travel to over a dozen other countries in Europe, and individuals may live in several countries over the course of a lifetime. A lot of them go from A to B, so UK to another country and back again, but they can go to different places. This time of year, the lesser blackback gulls which breed in the UK, most of them have left for warmer climes, Portugal, Morocco, Spain, that kind of thing. Other subspecies of lesser blackback gulls are now arriving from places like Scandinavia. Black-headed gulls and common gulls are arriving from places like Scandinavia and Iceland, which have then replaced the lessers that were breeding here and have now left. And some of the herring gulls you're seeing at the moment may be ones which usually spend summer slightly further north, but still in Scotland, which have come down for slightly better conditions. So the gulls you see day to day all through the year are probably not the same gulls and could be gulls born in various different countries. I'm studying lesser blackback gull migration at the moment, and some of them don't actually migrate at all, something which became a lot more common in the 1940s. But some of them travel maybe 200, 300 kilometers, while others travel well over 4,500 kilometers on migration. In fact, lesser blackback gulls have been recorded migrating over 6,000 kilometers at the age of only 3 months old, and some have been found flying non-stop over the Sahara. So if you ever wonder why I'm interested in gulls and gull migration, this is pretty much it. But even non-migratory herring gulls, they're not considered migratory, but they can go over to France, Portugal, Denmark, and sometimes they'll just go over to France for a foraging trip in one day and then come back, which makes me very envious. So the take-home message for gull migration is that there's really no set strategy. There's loads of variation in where they go, what they do. They can take a few days to migrate, or they can take several months. They really just do things how they want to, it seems. So this is a little bit of an extract from my research at the moment. These are 3 of the gulls which were tracked with GPS trackers a few years ago. You can see the variation in their strategies. So Clyde on the left-hand side, he migrated down the west-hand coast of the United Kingdom. He then hugged the coast to Mauritania, which is where he spent his winter. Jose migrated via Ireland. He then flew via the sea and then entered Spain via the coast, which is where he spent his winter. And then Archie also migrated via Ireland, but he didn't go very deep into the sea, and he then stayed in France for winter. And 2 gulls in the study, one called Kingpin and one with the amazing name of Luke Skywalker, decided to stay in Spain and Portugal rather than go home the next summer. Who can blame them? This really highlights the freedom gulls have. And for me, I think it just shows that human constructs like borders and movement constraints really are just human constructs, because birds just go wherever they want and they don't even necessarily go home again once they've left. So like myself, many people love gulls, I'm pleased to say, and these people are known as larophiles. I'd like to recommend to you all now a new hobby if you've not done it before, which is ring spotting. It's where you go out and you spot gulls wearing coloured rings or Darvik rings, as you can see here. You can also spot gulls with metal rings, but this is a lot harder because the ring code is a lot harder to read and it's not really designed to be seen with binoculars or a camera, but you can sometimes read the codes if you have a good enough camera. But all you need to do for the Darwick ring reading is to go out with a camera or a pair of binoculars. You can go out any really area you want where you might see gulls. It could be an urban area, it could be a rural area. You can go to a landfill if you'd like to, but most people would maybe rather go to a park with a pond. There's a lot of parks in Glasgow which are good for this sort of thing. Great fun for adults and children alike. And it's a realistic hobby because you might go out and spot nothing, but there are thousands of ring gulls in the UK. So it's realistic enough that I've reported probably a few dozen over the years. But most importantly, as well as being fun, it also aids in conservation. So you're achieving two things at once. If you report the ring to the BTO, bearing in mind, as well as the code, you also need to report the colours, so the colour of the ring and the colour of the impression, the ink, basically. You'll be told the history of the gull, the age of the gull, basically everything that's known about the gull, and if it's been spotted elsewhere. Sometimes you might end up finding a gull that's was ringed like 10 years before. Like you just don't know. It might be a gull from abroad. I read a metal ring of a black-headed gull last year, was able to get the metal ring, which was quite lucky. And it had been ringed in 2012 and hadn't been spotted again since I saw it in 2022, which is because it was a metal ring. So they're generally not reported very often. Some people travel quite far to read gull rings, not just around Scotland or even the UK, but some people actually go to Portugal or further away to places where gulls are known to overwinter, which is something I'm hoping to do next year because I would love to go on a holiday and spot as many ring gulls as I can. So you can really make a holiday out of it. One of the last ring gulls I saw was actually just outside the window here at my flat. I kind of feel sorry for my partner because he'd made a freshly baked loaf of bread the night before, and I then proceeded to tear up half of the loaf and threw it out the window. Luckily, he was okay with it, to try and keep the gull around so that we could read the ring, and we did. So it was all worth it. And luckily, he's a lyrophile too, so he didn't blame me too much for throwing half a loaf of bread out the window. So if you get really into gulls and gull ID, you might start talking or maybe even thinking like this when you look at gulls, talking of tertial skirts and too thin tail bands. Gull ID does get extremely intense and it's quite scary, to be honest. But just to make things even worse, you can also get three-way gull hybridization. So if you do plan on going into gull ID, then best of luck to you. This certainly goes over my head. I'm not nearly at this stage yet, but I'd like to think one day I will be. I wanted to do a little bit of gull ID of the 6 most commonly seen gulls in the UK. Obviously, people watching, I don't know whether you call gulls seagulls, whether you even care about changing how you speak about gulls. You might be a gull expert, you might know more about gulls than I do, but I'd like to do a little bit of gull ID. If you're interested, great. If not, no worries. But if you are someone who doesn't really know much about gulls, then this might be a great opportunity for you to learn a little bit more. So next time you look up and see a gull, you might actually be able to tell what it is, which to me is quite exciting, and maybe it will be to you as well. I hope so. So the gull on the left here, these are the small gulls, 3 small gulls and 3 larger gulls, most commonly seen in the UK. The black-headed gull, just to make things annoying and confusing, doesn't actually have a black head, but for all intents and purposes, we can call it black because it looks black. So black-headed, the adults in the breeding season have black heads, or juveniles or non-breeding season gulls have what I've always called DJ headsets. I guess nowadays you could say AirPods because sometimes they look like headsets in that they go over the head like this, or sometimes they're just dots. So DJ headsets or AirPods, you can call them either. They have dark red beaks and legs, or orange in the juveniles, and they have pale grey wings and mantle. Just remember the mantle just means the back. Black-legged kittiwakes. You don't often see kittiwakes, but in Newcastle, they actually have the world's most inland breeding kittiwake colony. So that's a great place to go and have a look at in summer. So as the name suggests, black-legged kittiwakes have black legs. They have a yellow beak, which is black in juveniles. They have pale grey wings and mantle, and they don't have mirrors. And I will explain what mirrors means in a minute because the common gull does have mirrors. But just have a look at the 2 pictures, see if you can figure out what mirrors might be. And now onto the common gull. Despite the name, they're actually not one of the most common gulls that you will see in the UK. They used to be a lot more common than they are. They've got greeny, yellowy legs. They have a yellow beak, like the kittiwake. Pale grey wings and mantle. So you might be thinking, wow, it's very similar to the kittiwake. But 2 things to note. First of all, the legs, obviously a different colour. but also they do have mirrors, and this has nothing to do with vanity. This is all in the primary or the outermost flight feathers. So if you look here, they have these little white dots. The kittiwake does not. People sometimes describe kittiwake feathers as having been dipped in black ink because it's just black, solid black, but common gulls have these white dots or mirrors. Another way I used to remember it as well is that if you look at these dots, they're almost like semicircles, and I used to think, oh, it's almost like a C, like C for common gull. Usually you'll see their legs though, so you don't really need to remember that, but then the more you can remember in terms of ID, the better, in case for some reason you can't see the whole of the gull. And onto the large gulls. Of the three large gulls that you're most likely to see in UK, bearing in mind there could be vagrants or species from other countries, but generally speaking, you'll be okay remembering these ones. The herring gull is the only one of the three with a pale grey back and pale grey wings, so that alone will help you to ID the herring gull. They've also got cute little pinky legs. They're larger than lesser blackback gulls, but they're smaller than great blackback gulls, which is easy to remember because the great blackback gull is the largest gull in the world. Lesser blackback gulls, again, smaller than the other two. They've got dark grey wings and dark grey mantle or back, and they've got yellow legs. You might be thinking they're quite similar to the great black gull, but I'll show you a picture in a minute to help you understand that they're actually quite different. The great blackback gull has very dark grey wings and mantle, not very obvious in this picture, but in a moment I'll show you a picture which makes it more obvious. They've got pink legs, so pink like the herring gull, but a different colour of back and wings, and not yellow like the lesser blackback gull. And yeah, they're the largest gull in the world, which are a lot larger than the other two. So that's the best way to tell them apart, which I will show you now. So the gull in the foreground is the lesser blackback gull. See, it's smaller, it's not as hefty, not as chunky, and it's also a lot paler. See how the other picture made them both look the same kind of colour, but the great blackback is a lot darker. It's got pink legs, slightly pinky, and the lessers are bright yellow. And bear in mind as well that in this picture, the lesser blackback is slightly closer to the camera than the great blackback. So if they were truly side by side, you see the difference even more. And I think great blackbacks often just kind of look like they've seen things, you know, like they have like more of a raw expression on their face. I'm not going to go into IDing the chicks because that would be a nightmare. But if you see animals like this, gulls, these are the gull chicks, young ones, juveniles. The large gulls take about 4 years to reach maturity, and the smaller gulls about 2 years. I was going to do this if we have time. I think we do because this will take about 3 minutes. But if you want to interrupt me, Lauren, feel free. This should only take a few minutes. Testing yourself. It's only 2 photos, so this won't take long at all. So these are the same species of gull. The one in the foreground is a juvenile, so bear that in mind. Think of the beak color and the head pattern. I know I only went over the ID for about a minute, so if you can't remember, don't worry at all, but it just might, you know, make you think a little bit about whether you can ID them or not. Possibly you already can ID them, but just have a little think. I'll just give you a few seconds while I take a drink because my throat is, you can probably hear my throat is struggling slightly, so I'll just take a drink and then reveal the answer. Okay, these are black-headed gulls. So you've got your red beak or orange beak in the juveniles, if you remember me saying. We've got our AirPods. Don't know what they're listening to, but I'm sure it's great. And they have their pale back and their pale wings. And the other small gulls also have pale back and pale wings, but it's good just to remember as much as you can about the species. It makes it easier. Second picture. So here we're focusing not on this gull in the foreground that you can barely see, but the gull on the left and the gull on the right. In fact, the gull in the foreground looks like a sub-adult. So this gull here and this gull here. So focus on the back color and the leg color. I will just, in my head, count down from about 5. Okay. It's the lesser blackback gull and the herring gull. So the one on the left is the lesser blackback gull. You see we've got the dark mantle, the dark wings, and the yellow legs. And the herring gull on the right, pale grey wings, pale grey back. Not that you can see the back, but you can see the wings. And pinky legs. And that's a wrap. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that you learned something or at least endured to the end. If you want to read an interesting paper about human-gull relationships, or if you want to read the gull trial report that I mentioned, please feel free to email me and I'll happily send them to you. There are also a few gull facts and anecdotes which I had to take out of this presentation because otherwise it would have been much too long. Happy to email them to you as well if you're interested. I know that I spent some of the time talking about why I don't say seagulls, but now I'm going to tell you to look at an account which uses the word seagull, believe it or not. It's the Instagram page Seagull World or seagull.world. They do use gulls in the description, you'll be pleased to hear, but they have some really sweet content and some really funny content of gulls. So if you're feeling interested in gulls, if you want to learn more about gulls, I'd recommend them as an account to follow.
Thank you so much, Flo. I think everyone agreed that was a greatly interesting presentation. And likewise, I've learned so much. I'm just going to launch straight into the questions so we have as much time as possible for them. There's two already in the chat, so I'll just read the first one out. So it's a note that says this attendee has been feeding gulls, and she's asking, not only would they recognise me in the street, they'd also bring me gifts, usually nesting material. If research on that exists, or based on your observations, were the gifts a bribe or a sign of affection?
Oh, I don't know, because I've heard about people getting gifts from crows, and I've fed crows and I've never had any gifts. Maybe they just didn't like me, but I feel like it's probably more of a bribe. And the reason I say that is because this is just opinion from, understand that. But as I said before in the talk, these gulls have a tough life. Like everything they do is about survival. So if they're thinking what they need to do, they think I need food and they're doing whatever they can to get food. They're not really going to be spending much of their time going out of their way to do something they don't feel they need to do. So I reckon it's more about survival. It's a bribe, or at least something they think will help them get more food. You can consider it a gift, I suppose, because they are bringing you something. But their life really is about surviving and getting the next meal. So I think they're in their heads, they're just thinking, do this to get themselves food rather than thinking I'm being generous right now. But that is truly my opinion. I could be completely wrong.
That's brilliant, thank you. The next one is this was in response to your part about the human wildlife solution. See, it seems ridiculous that if it was only lethal control. Not surprised though. I heard herring gulls are on the red list for endangered birds in the UK. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. The numbers have gone down very rapidly, and you can still there's still a lot of licenses which let people kill them. In fact, my partner, Human-gull Solutions, he does a lot of gull work too, and he's been doing a lot of work into this lately. Hopefully more will be coming out of this in the next year, because it really is terrible, not only the fact that they can still be culled in quite high numbers and a lot of their eggs taken, but also just the way that they're treated in society. You think a rid-less species, we'd be doing more to make people like them, but the media is still saying horrible things about them. So yeah, it is very true. And the lesser blackback gull is amber listed, and a lot of the other gulls I talked about are amber listed as well. So they really are struggling, and it's something we need to spend more time thinking about, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. This isn't a question, but I'll just read out one of the comments that have just popped in the chat. So Scarborough Borough Council have been unconsciously cruel to kittiwakes who lived under a bridge. It's disgraceful and against the wishes of the majority of the residents. Just wonder if you have any thoughts on that comment.
Well, I don't know what exactly you're referencing, but if you want to email me, then I can put you in contact with my partner. He's always working on anti-culling things and all sorts of stuff to do with being against culling, so I can see what we can do. But it can be quite hard sometimes because they've been doing it for years. It's really just about whether they're happy to change their behaviors, and if they can get away with doing things the way they've been doing it for years, they'll continue, unfortunately. But yeah, if you want to send me an email, I can certainly see what my partner and I can do about it, if there's anything whatsoever that we can try and do.
Oh, another question has just came in. So it's, what can we do to help gulls? Any practical action we can take? Thank you, that's a great question.
Yeah, I actually wondered if someone might ask that, and it's really hard because I wouldn't recommend like everyone start becoming a gull rehabilitator or anything like that, just like looking out for gulls, and if a gull needs help, then try and be there for it, because a lot of people will look at an injured animal and think, oh, that's not my problem. So I guess just always be aware of any injured animals that need help. Always phone for advice before you do anything, like a wildlife rescue centre. But really, I think the main thing that gulls need is just a better narrative. So if you can talk about gulls in a positive light and try your best to dispel myths and just be a positive voice for gulls, I think that's the main thing they need, because the way that the public see them is horrendous. Like I've seen videos of people treating them badly, and you have people who would be extremely angry if someone was to mistreat a cat or a dog, laughing at these videos. So otherwise normal people are completely okay with animal abuse when it comes to gulls. So I really think just being a voice for the gulls is the most important thing you can do. But yeah, just find out about them and just really being interested in them, because not enough people are.
Thank you, Flo. There's another great question that's just popped in the chat. So have gull numbers been impacted by avian flu? Have they developed an immunity like gannets seem to have?
Yeah, I've not found like tons on this, but certainly black-headed gulls have been really badly affected by avian flu. It seems that the other species haven't been as badly affected compared to black-headed, at least from what I know. But for some reason, black-headed gulls have been quite badly affected, and a lot of other seabirds as well. I haven't heard anything about them having immunity to it now, not like the gannets as the person mentioned. But certainly, as I say, black-headed gulls. And I actually saw a gull a year ago, which was believed to have avian flu, but unfortunately, wildlife rescue centres and vets generally won't take in animals that are known to have bird flu, because they can get shut down. They can have all the animals on site culled, so it's sad that not a lot can be done about it. Yeah, in terms of gulls, I don't really know, but I certainly know that black-headed gulls have been hit very badly.
Thank you. Again, not a question, but just a comment I thought it'd be good to read out. Someone's popped in the chat how they're going to look forward to seeing gulls now and having a go at identifying them. And I think everyone agree with that from this presentation. And lots of nice compliments for your presentation as well.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And as I said, feel free to email me, even if you just want to ask for any of the slides or ask any questions, completely free, or message me on Twitter, Instagram, absolutely. I love talking about gulls, so please give me an excuse to do it more.
We just have a few more minutes left, so if anyone has any further questions, pop in the chat or just take a moment now to speak out loud.
I'm just going to put my email in the chat because someone's asked, and a good point, because I did just close my slides.
I was just about to go and do that, but you'll do it faster.
And the handle, the @ that's for Twitter and or Instagram. Thank you for everyone's nice comments. I just loved talking about gulls, and I'm glad that people like listening.
I thought that was fascinating, Flo. Like, I had no idea there was more than 51 species of gull, but to be honest, I think my identification is so poor that at the moment I'm just going to go with big one and small one, because that's the best I can do for now, and feet. But yeah, absolutely fascinating, and it's amazing to hear that you're doing such great work and advocating for them. And you are right, we have this really warped I mean, generally in society, have this really warped perception of which animals are good and which animals are bad. And as you say, it's based mostly on our own sort of interactions, or, yeah, it's really interesting that the majority of people still don't necessarily view animals from their perspective, but only our own. And also, I will promise not to call them seagulls ever again.
I was actually going to ask anyone who's still online. I wondered if anyone's actually gone from calling them seagulls who's now going to try and call them gulls, or find out the species name. I'd be really interested to know if anyone who's still online is maybe going to change the way they talk about gulls, or the way that they name gulls, if anyone wants to answer in the chat.
I'll just read out one final question that's popped in the chat. So it says, did you say that some herring gulls migrate?
Okay, so herring gulls are generally seen as either non-migrants or very, very short distance. Like, you might not even describe them as migrants. They can travel maybe like 50 kilometers away generally, so they don't tend to go that far, and some of them will stay where they are. But through my research so far with migration, really the most important thing to understand is that there's no set template. The variation is astounding between individuals. So some herring gulls will travel a little bit to slightly warmer areas within the same country, but they can also take day trips or weekend trips to countries. I think it was Portugal, Denmark, and France they've been found going to. They're not generally doing long distance migrations like lesser blackback gulls, for example, but again, variations. Some individuals will go further than others. They do generally stay in the same country though, when it comes to traveling for winter. But there actually was a study, not one that I agree with, by the way, that was done a few decades ago, whereby herring gull eggs were put in lesser blackback gull nests. So lesser blackback gulls were rearing herring gulls, so migratory bird was rearing a non-migratory bird, and they actually then found that the herring gulls were migrating. Gulls don't migrate with their parents or their partners. They migrate on their own, and gull chicks can actually migrate before their parents. So it's instinctive. The migrating is instinctive, although they do learn as they get older. But they reckon the reason the herring gulls were migrating is because they tend to stay with their parents for quite a few months in the UK. And so when their lesser blackback parents were migrating, the herring gulls thought, where's my mum going without feeding me? And they just followed them all the way to Portugal or Spain for food, which is quite interesting because they don't migrate, but they were that kind of, associated their parents with food that much. They traveled a few hundred miles just to be with their parents, which is kind of sad, but it's also quite interesting. As I say, it's not an experiment that I would want to be a part of.
Thank you. Sorry, actually, if I may actually ask one last question. But
cool.
before I do, I'll just add as well, I've popped in the chat a link to our webinars, as Kevin of Humane Wildlife Solutions, which Flo obviously spoke about in our presentation, is doing a webinar on the 14th of December, so you can still book your place for that. But the actual last question is, if you should feed gulls or not?
Was the question just should we feed them or not?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So the reason I asked is because I disagree with feeding gulls from your hand, because that's the kind of thing that makes gulls take food from people and then they go, oh, evil gulls. But I don't have a problem with people putting food out for gulls. I think the most important thing is, first of all, to feed them something which isn't bad for them, and also to feed them a small enough amount for two reasons. You want to feed them a small amount, firstly, because you don't want them to rely on you. If you go on holiday or if you move house, you don't want this gull to be struggling. And second of all, because you want them to be getting, I say natural food, obviously it could be urban sources, but you want them to be getting a variation of food. If you're feeding them something that's not ideal for them, then you don't want that to be their whole diet. Make sure if you are feeding them, it is something that is good for them. But yeah, I'd say it's okay as long as you're not feeding them their whole diet. But one of the gulls who I mentioned, the kingpin, his GPS tracker in the study was actually just a line from his nest site to this woman's house. It was just a straight line every day because she fed him in her kitchen, and his whole behavior every single day for months was just surrounding this house. He'd go to the house, get food, forage around the house, go home. And it's funny to look at, but I don't think a gull should be basing its whole life off a person. So if you do feed them, don't feed them too much, and make sure that what you are feeding them is gull safe, and don't let them associate that with you as a person. Maybe do it at the end of your garden, for example.
Okay, thank you so much, Flo. That's the end of the questions. I'll pass back over to Laura now. But again, lots of praise for your presentation, and lots of people saying that they were going to stop calling gulls seagulls now. So
Oh, great.